This is Douglas Edwards, bringing you Retrospect, a film excursion into past events, events which form the patterns by which we live today.
Retrospect is brought to you by the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization in cooperation with your local Civil Defense Office and your local station. And now here's your host, Douglas Edwards.
What all men are really after, said Joseph Conrad, is some form, or perhaps only some formula, of peace. In the past 50 years, 4 major peace treaties have been written into the pages of history. Each, at the time of its ratification, represented a turning point in world affairs, and each was preceded by the drama of a formal surrender ceremony. The first and second of these ceremonies occurred 22 years apart in the same city, not by coincidence, but by an act of calculated irony. World War I ended on November 11, 1918. Germany signed the official surrender document in this railroad car at Compiègne, France. 7 months later at Versailles, Germany submitted to stern political, military, and naval conditions and relinquished large sections of her European territory and all of her colonial possessions. Only a few years would pass after this Big Four meeting before Hitler would be promising revenge for the humiliation of 1918, promising that heads would roll. And so it came to pass. On June 22nd, 1940, France had been in the Second World War less than 10 months. The Maginot Line, said France to the free world, was impregnable. But the irresistible force of Hitler's war machine had found the Maginot Line a pitifully movable object. Now came that glorious moment the Fuhrer had promised the master race, the expiation of November 1918. And what could be more fitting than that same railroad car at Compiègne in which Germany had been brought to her knees? The sweet irony of it was music to the Nazis. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of World War I, represented the French. France's grand old soldier would later betray his country by collaborating with Hitler. The French contingent solemnly boarded the train, filed in to face their subjectors. Pétain saluted the Fuhrer and then took pen in hand to seal French defeat in one humiliating stroke. Five years later, Germany's turn came again. Before the formal armistice took place, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Commander-in-Chief of the Anglo-American armies in Europe, accepted the surrender of 500,000 German troops. The date was May 4, 1945. And then on May 7th, at General Eisenhower's headquarters in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, an unconditional surrender ceremony took place. Signing on behalf of the German government, Colonel Gustav Jodl, Hitler's right-hand man on military affairs. For the United States, General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur presided over the final Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945. 18 days earlier, the Empire of Japan had accepted unconditional surrender terms. After almost 4 years of war, justice and retribution had finally been achieved. In a dramatic 20-minute ceremony on the deck of the battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, a stern-looking MacArthur watched as Mamoru Shigemitsu signed on behalf of the Emperor. The Japanese, all formally attired, went through the motions with stiff grimness. A highlight of the ceremony came when General Hama, perpetrator of the infamous Bataan Death March, signed for the Japanese military establishment. He did not even bother to be seated. 2 years later, at the war crimes trials in Tokyo, General Hama was sentenced to hang. After all Japanese representatives signed, there came the most dramatic moment of the ceremony. General MacArthur seated himself at the table to sign for the United States. And then, with a flourish of poetic justice, he turned and gave his pen to General Jonathan Wainwright, the courageous defender of Corregidor. A peace treaty of the future would also be preceded by a surrender ceremony, and the surrender ceremony by a war. If war is to be prevented, one way is through preparedness. The director of the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization has called upon every American to help strengthen the defense of the country by strengthening the defense of his own home. Today's guest is Mr. George Glenn from the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization. Mr. Glenn, we've heard about the OCDM's national plan. Now, just what is this plan?
The national plan, with its 39 annexes, is the blueprint for survival and recovery. It is the model for all state and local governments. Today, there are 50 of these state plans, 240 metropolitan area plans, and over 2,500 community plans. Our national plan covers the specific jobs for the protection of life and property. For example, preparations for the continuity of government, warning, damage assessment, communications, maintenance of law and order, and many, many others. It also covers mobilization of the national resources. The National Manpower Annex, for example, deals with the nation's manpower availability. The health plan covers steps to assure medical care. The food plan outlines responsibilities for conservation and distribution of food. The list is very extensive, but this will give you an idea.
Mr. Glenn, are all these plans being converted into action?
Yes. For example, we have completed an excellent warning system. The continuity of government program is completed in most states. We have stockpiled $225 million worth of medical and engineering supplies. Over 2,000 emergency hospitals are stored throughout the country. We have $8 billion worth of materials stockpiled for recovery. We have an ample supply of food in the commodity credit stockpile. As you know, the shelter program is moving ahead at a good pace. Shelters are being constructed in private homes.
Such as this shelter here, for instance.
Such as this for the private homes, office buildings, and schools. These are a few of the accomplishments, but I must repeat again. The individual citizen is the key to an effective civil defense program.
Well, now, Mr. Glenn, as a citizen, what can I do to help my family survive?
Well, there are 5 steps to home preparedness. First, know your warning signals and what they mean. These signals are the same throughout the nation. A steady blast of 3 to 5 minutes means take action as directed by your local government. The second signal is a wailing tone, or a series of short blasts lasting for 3 minutes. This means take cover immediately in the best available shelter. Second, know your community plan for emergency action. As I said, over 2,500 communities already have emergency plans ready to activate on a moment's notice.
How can we find out just exactly what those plans are, Mr. Glenn?
Call your local civil defense office, mayor, city manager, or other local officials. If there is no plan, exert your rights as a citizen and request that a definite plan be drawn up. Now, third, protect your family by providing an adequate fallout shelter and stock it with a 2-week supply of emergency food and water. And fourth, at least one member of every family should be trained in first aid. Call either Red Cross or Civil Defense and find out when the next course is being given in your community. And fifth, and this is the last step, make sure you know the Conrad frequencies of 640 and 1240 on your AM radio dial. In case of attack, this will be your only means of receiving official instruction or information. These are the 5 steps, Mr. Edwards. They are not complicated, difficult, nor will they take much time. But they may save your life during attack.
5 very important steps indeed. Thank you, Mr. Glenn, for your information on individual survival steps. And don't forget to stop in at your local civil and defense office, ask for your free copy of this handy wallet-sized card listing the home preparedness information on one side and the warning signals on the other. Get your copy, carry it with you at all times. For centuries, the royal family of Great Britain has held a high place of dignity and veneration in the hearts of the British people. A Briton who shouts, "God save the Queen," might also be saying, "God save the symbol of our greatness." Since the turn of the century, 4 kings and 2 queens have occupied the throne of England. This was London as it looked in 1901, the 63rd year of the Victorian era. Victoria had occupied the throne longer than any monarch in English history. At her death, she was known as the grandmother of Europe, her 5 children having all married into other European royal families. Edward VII ruled from 1901 to 1910, strengthening contact between the crown and the people. When Edward died, his oldest living son was crowned George V. The new king found the pomp and ceremony of royal functions to be annoying. He was a good sportsman, fond of hunting and attending the races. His greatest period of popularity came during the catastrophic period which he had done his best to forestall, World War I. George V spent a great part of the war visiting the wounded in the hospitals of World War I. On 3 occasions, he made visits to the troops on the Belgian and French battlefronts. In the early 20s, the Prince of Wales would follow his father to the throne as Edward VIII. He made a visit to the United States. At that time, he had already met the woman he loved. The shock of the only voluntary abdication in English history would come only 11 months after his coronation. In May of 1935, George V celebrated the 25th year of his reign. Eight months later, Great Britain was mourning his death. He had been one of the most popular kings in all of English history. On May 12, 1937, after the abdication of Edward VIII, the Duke of York ascended the throne as George VI. During World War II, the new king and his family shared the perils of their subjects by maintaining residence in Buckingham Palace throughout the German Blitz. When George VI died in 1952, Great Britain crowned its first ruling queen in 51 years, Elizabeth II. Among Englishmen everywhere, there was hope that their new queen's ascendancy might foreshadow Great Britain's return to what was known as the spacious age of Elizabeth. Well, before we close the show today, this final and vital reminder that we can survive nuclear war if each of us knows and takes action on the 5 fundamental steps to preparedness. 1, know your warning signals and what they mean. 2, know your community plan for emergency action. 3, prepare a fallout shelter. Stock it with a 14-day food and water supply. 4, take a first aid course. 5, know the Conelrad frequencies, 640 and 1240 on your AM radio dial. Each individual who follows these steps can help protect America. We hope you've enjoyed a glimpse at the world in retrospect and that you'll be with us on our next excursion into the past. This is Douglas Edwards saying goodbye for now.
Retrospect, starring Douglas Edwards, was brought to you by the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization in cooperation with your local Civil Defense Office and your local station. Survival in the nuclear age is a personal responsibility, touching every American family. Make sure you take part. Learn the facts about civil defense preparedness. Start your home preparedness program today. The prepared family builds a prepared nation. Civil defense is an American tradition.